there is a profound gap between the way that the West looks at us and the way we look at ourselves. And it is a gap that I think is rooted to some significant extent, maybe even a very significant extent, in the gap between the Jews of the West and the Jews of Israel. We have today two Jewish civilizations. And they're basically the two Jews who survived the 20th century, the English-speaking Jew and the Hebrew-speaking Jew. In the 20th century, you either learned Hebrew, learned English, or died. That's the story of the Jews. Every time I say something like that, French Jews raise their hand and get angry at me. But they're the third largest Jewish community after Israel and America. But French Jews are the exception that proves the rule, because French Jewry is 90% Sephardi. They're 90% from North Africa. After the Holocaust, France is refilled with Jews because North Africa empties of its Jews. See, for example, Algeria. And so they're the exception to this rule that absolutely proves the rule. And they've had radically different histories. The story of American Jews, who are the lens through which America and larger parts of the West and the left see Israel, is a story of the promise of liberalism coming true in astonishing ways. When the Jews land in America, these 2.5 million refugees who flee 1,300 pogroms and 250,000 dead and horrific oppression and laws against them in the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the new Romania and all of these different things that are happening in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to Jews. And Europe is slowly but very, very clearly becoming literally uninhabitable to Jews, and millions are fleeing. And the vast majority flee to the United States. And these 2.5 million Jews land in America, and they discover, for the very first time in Jewish history, it had never happened before, no Jew had ever seen this before, a country that actually, genuinely, truly believed that they belonged to it. It wasn't that the Jews fantasized, as in Germany for certain periods, that they could become Germans, but the Germans never had that fantasy about the Jews. It wasn't that the Jews thought maybe there was integration in our future in the Russian Empire, and the Russians never, ever, not even under communist rule when that was the official ideology, but still it said Jew in your passport. Jews could never be Russian, according to the Russians, and Jews could never be Germans, according to the Germans, and Bulgarians, and by the way, Iraqis. But the Jews could suddenly be Americans, and all America thought so. And that's weird. That is an absolute unique exception. It happened a little bit also in the rest of the English-speaking world. It happened in Canada as well.
It's an aberration.
It's an aberration, and it felt to the Jews of America like an end to Jewish history, to the Jewish history of pain. And that's one reason that American Jews stopped teaching history about 5 generations ago. And you today have young people on your college campuses who think that the entire experience of millions of refugees and vast pain and hundreds of pogroms and death tolls into the 6 figures, the 20th century is the bloodiest century in Jewish history without the Holocaust. And all of that history has been reduced essentially to fiddler in the American Jewish imagination, because they consciously decided to stop teaching history, because history had ended, because America was the answer. American Jews are home in a homeland that's not quite America, it's American liberalism. And that existence in that homeland is a radically new Jewish world, Jewish community, Jewish psyche. The promise of liberalism came true so utterly and profoundly that it created a whole new kind of Jew. Who are the Israelis? The Israelis are the exact mirror image opposite of that. They're the Jews that went through the 20th century, because when America put up its quota laws in 21 and 1924, and they're the Jews who couldn't get in. And they couldn't get into Canada and Britain and Brazil and Australia. All the nations of the world in the 20s and 30s, for various reasons, put up quota laws and immigration laws. South Africa passed 4 distinct immigration laws to keep the Jews out, including one in 1937 targeting German Jews. The whole point was, Europe deals with the Jewish problem. We don't deal with the Jewish problem. Jews became undeportable. That was the Nazi problem. They wanted to get rid of the Jews by deportation. They couldn't. Nobody would take them at a certain point. And so they had to kill them. That was how the Nazis thought of it. And these immigration laws corralled the Jews into the gas chambers. But even after the Holocaust, these people who would become Israelis still watched as the world wouldn't take them in. I was in a high school AP American history class in Wisconsin in 1998 or so. Um, and My teacher talked about how the British liberated Bergen-Belsen and the American soldiers liberated Buchenwald and Dachau. And then the books closed, and the next day we talked about the Vietnam War.
Yeah, sure.
And I raised my hand and I said, wait a second. You think that the American troops liberated Bergen-Belsen and Dachau and Buchenwald, the American and British troops? The Jews are still living there 3 years later. What does liberated mean? Truman begged Congress to let them in, and Congress refused. The quotas were never lifted after the world knew everything there is to know about Auschwitz. Nobody on earth, the International Refugee Organization, brought dozens of governments to the camps to set up booths, interview the million DPs who couldn't go home. And every single non-Jew, 750,000, was given citizenship in new countries and taken away. And after the IRO closes up shop and shuts down its booths and leaves, the last 250,000 DPs, by the end of 1946, I believe it was, every last one of them is a Jew. The Jews watched as the world carefully sifted after the Holocaust. The entirety of the West carefully sifted through the last survivors. When Congress shuts the doors in the 1920s, there's potentially 8 million Jews who could flee Europe to America. Nobody wants 8 million Jews. That's way too many. But the last 250,000 of a shattered remnants, the Nazis lost to the Allies, but they didn't lose the war on the Jews. They destroyed European Jewry. And that last 250,000 had no place to go. When did the DP camps start emptying out in large numbers? In May 1948. And those DPs are a quarter of the IDF. And so what is the Israeli Jewish experience of history? And this is exactly speaks to your question of living on our sword, of fighting forever and ever. The world is capable of watching you die, shrugging and turning away. And the best of the world, the most moral, and the American empire that created the greatest happiness and prosperity in the history, the Pax Americana is a period everybody's going to miss, especially the people who complained about it the most. And that part of the world, that great America that the Jews who did make it in, they actually allowed to become Americans in a way that there is no compliment paid in the history of the world to any nation on this earth than the Jewish experience of America. But any Jew who didn't get in watched America sit and look at them as they died.